I had several arrangements to make for transport at Rorke's Drift, amongst others the erection of a gallows for making reams. This gallows was some 15 feet high, and the process consisted of cutting hides of bullocks into strips about an inch wide, working in a circle. The strips then had the appearance of a peel of an apple, all coiled up, and in order to be fashioned into straight straps had to be passed over the gallows and through a weighted wagon wheel below. The strips were then worked over the gallows and through the wheel, stretched and rubbed with fat until the curves were lost, resulting in very long, soft strips of hide that could eventually be cut into lengths for tying to the horns of oxen as head ropes. It is interesting to relate that the first use I saw for the gallows was for hanging Zulus who were supposed to have behaved treacherously the day after the Rorke's Drift fight. After starting the gallows, I went to see Captain Gonny Bromhead, in command of the company of the 24th, and I told him a big fight was expected, and that I wanted revolver ammunition. He gave me 11 rounds, and hearing heavy guns over at Isandlwana, I rode off and got into that camp about 8 a.m., just as Colonel Durnford's force arrived. Colonel Durnford was having a discussion with Lieutenant Colonel Poulin of the 24th, who had been left by Lord Chelmsford in command of the camp. Chelmsford and all the troops, including the 2nd 24th, having gone out to attack the Zulus. Lieutenant Colonel Poulin's force consisted of 6 companies of the 1st 24th, guns under Brevet Major Smith and Lieutenant Curling, and some native levies. As far as I could make out, the gist of Colonel Durnford's and Poulin's discussion was that the former wished to go out and attack the Zulus, whilst the latter argued that his orders were to defend the camp, and that he could not allow his infantry to move out. Colonel Durnford and his rocket battery under Russell of the Royal Artillery, and his mounted basutos under Cochrane, then rode off towards a small hill, apparently a spur of the main range, and about 1.5 miles from the camp. Of the 24th, 1 company, under Lieutenant Carine, was on picket out of sight of the camp and about a mile to the north of the main range. We could hear heavy firing in that direction, even then, at about 8 a.m. This company was reinforced later by 2 more, Mostins and Dysons, and the 3 fell back fighting about noon and covered the north side of the camp. The remaining 3 companies present, for 2 under Major Upker and Lieutenant Clements Palms Heaton and Lloyd, only reached Helpmacher on the 22nd from the old colony. They were extended around the camp in attack formation, covering especially the front and the left front. 2 battalions of native levies were also in the line, but they were not to be relied on and were feebly armed, only 1 man in 10 being allowed a rifle, lest they desert to the enemy. In consequence of the heavy firing to the north, and the appearance of a large number of Zulus on the main range of hills, and partly, I believe, to support Colonel Durnford's movement, the line was pushed out on a curve, but to no great distance from the tents. Farther than that, it never went. Our 2 guns were at the same time pushed out into the firing line to the northeast of the camp. At about 12 a.m., the Zulus, who had apparently fallen back behind the hills, again showed in large numbers, coming down into the plain over the hills with great boldness, and our guns and our rifles were pretty busy for some time, causing the Zulus again to fall back. It was difficult to see exactly what was going on, but firing was heavy. It was evident now that the Zulus were in great force, for they could be seen extending, throwing out their horns, away across the plain to the southeast, apparently working towards the right rear of the camp. As far as I can make out, Colonel Durnford and his force never actually left the plain, but were close under the foot of a small spur, one he originally went to seize. Nothing of importance beyond the constant increase of the Zulus and the spreading out of the horns, until about 1 p.m., when they started their forward movement direct on the camp. Our troops were in the positions they had occupied hours before, our 2 guns busy throughout, shelling the enemy. 45 empty wagons stood in the camp, with the oxen in. It was a convoy which I was to have taken to Rorke's Drift for supplies early in the morning, but which was stopped until after the enemy should be driven off. These wagons might have any time been formed into a laager, but no one appeared to appreciate the gravity of the situation. So much so, no steps were taken until too late to issue extra ammunition from the large reserves we had in the camp. I will return to the advancing Zulu's line at about 1 p.m. It was a marvellous sight. Line upon line of men in slightly extended order, one behind the other, firing as they came along, for few of them had firearms, bearing all before them. The rocket battery, apparently then only a mile to our front, was firing. And suddenly it ceased, and presently we saw the remnants of Durnford's force, mostly mounted, galloping back to the right of our position. What had actually happened I don't think we should ever know accurately. The ground was intersected with dongas, and in them Russell and his rocket battery, and none escaped to tell the tale. I heard later that Durnford, who was a gallant leader, actually reached the camp and fell there fighting. And now the Zulu army, having swept away Durnford's force, flushed with victory, moved steadily on to where the 5 companies of the 24th were lying down covering the camp. They were giving vent to no loud war cries, but to a low, musical, murmuring noise, which gave the impression of a gigantic swarm of bees getting nearer and nearer. Here was a more serious matter for these brave warriors, for the regiment opposed to them were no boy recruits, but war-worn, matured men, mostly with beards, and fresh from a long campaign in the old colony, where they had carried everything before them. Possessed of splendid discipline and sure of success, they lay on their position, making every round tell, so much so that when the Zulu army was some 400 yards off, it wavered. After the war, the Zulus, who were delightfully naive and truthful people, told us that the fire was too hot for them, and they were on the verge of retreat when suddenly the fire slackened, and they came on again. The reader will ask why the fire slackened, and alas, the answer is because with thousands of rounds in the wagons, 400 yards in the rear, there was none in the firing line, and it had all been used up. I will mention a story which speaks for the coolness and discipline of the regiment. Having no particular duty to perform in the camp, when I saw the whole Zulu army advancing, I collected camp stragglers such as artillerymen in charge of spare horses, officers, servants, sick, etc., and taking them to the ammunition boxes, where we broke them open as fast as we could, and kept sending out the packets to the firing line. In those days the boxes were screwed down, and it was a very difficult job to get them open, and it was owing to this battle that the construction of the ammunition boxes was changed. When I had been engaged in this for some time, and the 1st 24th had fallen back to where we were, with the Zulus following them, Bloomfield, the quartermaster of the 2nd 24th, said to me in regard to the boxes I was breaking open, "For heaven's sake, don't take that, man, for it belongs to our battalion." And I replied, "Hang it all, do you want a requisition now, do you?" It was about that time, too, that a colonial named Dubois, a wagon conductor, said to me, "The game is up. If I had a good horse, I would ride straight for Maritzburg." I never saw him again. I then saw Sergeant Major Shepherd, busy in the depression, treating wounded. That's the last time I ever saw him. To return to the fight, our right flank had become enveloped by the horn of the Zulus, and the levies were flying before them. All the transport drivers, panic-stricken, were jostling each other with their teams and wagons, shouting and yelling at the cattle, and striving to get over the neck onto Roxdrift Road. And the red line of the 24th, having fixed bayonets, appeared to have but one idea, and that was to defeat the enemy. The Zulu charge came home, and driven with their backs to the rock of Isandlwana and overpowered by about 30-1, they sold their lives dearly. The best proof of this is the subsequent description of the Zulus themselves, who, so far from looking on it as a decisive victory, used to relate how their wagons were for days removing their dead, and how the country ran rivers of tears, almost every family bemoaning the loss of some relative. When this final charge took place, the transport, which was ill-spanned and mostly cleared the neck, and I jumped on my broken-kneed pony, which had had no rest for 30 hours, and followed it, to find on topping the neck a scene of confusion I shall never forget. For some 4,000 Zulus had come in behind and were busy with shield and assegai, and into this mess I rode, revolver in hand, right through the Zulus. But they completely ignored me. I heard afterwards that they had been told by King Ketchweo that black coats were civilians and were not worth killing, and I had a blue patrol jacket on, and it is noticeable that only 5 officers who escaped, Essex, Cochrane, Gardner, Curling, and myself, all had blue coats. The Zulus throughout my escape seemed to be set on killing natives who have sided with us, either as fighting levies or transport drivers. After getting through the mass of the Zulus busy slaying, I followed on in the line of fugitives. The outer horns of the Zulu army had been directed to meet us about a mile to the southeast of the camp, and they were still some distance apart when the retreat commenced. It was this gap which fixed the line of retreat. I could see the Zulus running in to complete their circle from both flanks, and their leading men had already reached the line of retreat long before I had got there. When I reached the point, I came on the 2 guns, which must have been sent out of camp before the Zulus charged home. They appeared to me to be upset in a donga and surrounded by Zulus. Again I rode through unheeded, and shortly after was passed by Coghill, a lieutenant of the 24th, wearing a blue patrol and cord breeches and riding a red roan horse. We had just exchanged remarks about the terrible disaster, and he passed on towards Fugitives' Drift. A little further on, I caught up with Lieutenant Curling of the Royal Artillery, and spoke to him, pointing out to him that the Zulus were all round and urging him to push on, which he did. My own broken-kneed transport pony then done to a turn, and incapable of rapid progress. The ground was terribly bad going, all rocks and boulders, and it was about 3 or 4 miles from camp to Fugitives' Drift. When approaching this drift and about half a mile behind Coghill, Lieutenant Melville of the 24th, in a red coat, and with a cased colour across the front of his saddle, passed me going to the drift. I reported afterwards that the colour was broken, but the pole was eventually found whole, I think. The casing must have been cut half off and was hanging down. It was thus to be seen that Coghill, who was an orderly officer to Colonel Glynn, and Melville, who was his adjutant, did not escape together with the colour. How Coghill came in the camp I do not know, as Colonel Glynn, whose orderly officer he was out with Lord Chelmsford's column. I then came to Fugitives' Drift, the descent to which was almost a precipice. I found there a man in a red coat, badly assegaied in the arm, unable to move. He was, I believe, a mounted infantryman of the 24th named MacDonald, but of his name I cannot be sure. I managed to make a tourniquet with a handkerchief to stop the bleeding, and got him halfway down when a shout from behind me said, "Get on, man! The Zulus are on top of you!" I turned round and saw Major Smith of the artillery, who was commanding the section of guns, as white as a sheet and bleeding profusely. And in a second we were surrounded, and assegais accounted for poor Smith, my wounded friend. and my horse. With the help of my revolver and a wild jump down the rocks, I found myself in the Buffalo River, which was in flood and 80 yards broad. I was carried away, but luckily got hold of the tail of a loose horse, which towed me across to the other bank. I was too exhausted to stick to him, and up this bank were swarming friendly natives, but I only saw one European, and a colonial and an acting commissariat officer named Hammer, lying there unable to move. I managed to catch a loose horse and put him on it, and he escaped. The Zulus were pouring in under a very heavy fire from the opposite bank, and dropped several friendly natives as we climbed to the top. No sooner as I had achieved this than I saw a lot of Zulus had crossed higher up and were running to cut me off. This drove me off to the left, but 20 of them still pursued for about 3 miles, and I managed to keep them off with my revolver. I got to Helpmacar about sundown, having done 20 miles on foot from the river, for I almost went to Sansprit. At Helpmacar I found Huntley of the 10th, who had been left there with a small garrison, and also Essex, Cochrane, Curling and Gardner from the field at Isandlwana, all busy placing the post in a state of defence. We could see that night the watchfires of the Zulu, some 6 miles off, and expected them to come on and attack, but we knew later they had turned off to attack Rorke's Drift. I at once took command of one face of the laager, and shall never forget how pleased we weary watchers were when, shortly after midnight, Major Upcher's 2 companies of the 24th, with Heaton, Palms, Clements and Lloyd, came to reinforce. These 2 companies had started for Rorke's Drift that afternoon, but had been turned back at Helpmacar by Major Spaulding, the staff officer, as he said Rorke's Drift had been surrounded and captured, and that the 2 companies would share the same fate. Luckily, his information proved to be wrong.